All right, we've covered a lot of mechanisms of moral disengagement. Let's zoom out now and look at how these moral disengagement thinking patterns and behaviors come to be in a person. Bandura proposes that they come to be incrementally, in a progressive fashion. Small steps toward harm and cruelty, maybe in the form of insults or humiliation, are given justifications or reframed as they deserved it. Slowly, Bandura proposes, people begin to tolerate being more harmful, and they need fewer explicit justifications or reframes to do it. The harm, and at its worst, the inhumanity, comes when the self-sanctions are absent. When the person has fully integrated the inhumane behaviors into their understanding of what is normal. This can all occur, he notes, without the person even noticing. Where does moral disengagement happen? And does it happen the same way everywhere? Bandura highlights the role of moral disengagement at the social systems level, and this turns out to show us that moral disengagement is applicable to a wide variety of fields and industry. You can check out the whole book for many rich examples of how participation in social systems helps vindicate specific harmful acts, including participation in government and religious organizations, in research, in entertainment, and in sports. In these different places, moral disengagement takes many fascinating forms, fitting in with the norms of these contexts. Now, let's think back to the study by Shackroff et al. On indirect speech. Shackroff proposed that people use indirect speech for their immoral acts, not necessarily out of bad intentions, but because they're so motivated to retain a view of the self as good. Where does Bandura stand on this? Bandura is less convinced that people self-deceive like that. Bandura seems to reject the idea that we're typically lying to ourselves without being aware of it when we employ these mechanisms of moral disengagement. Bandura is very interested in people having their agency. So his stance, you can recall from the beginning of the lecture, is that all this information about our moral disengagement mechanisms, it's empowering because it allows people to have agency and control, to intervene on their own thinking and subsequently their behavior. Other researchers insist we just don't have this control. And Shackroff's position says that it's in our quest to act morally permissible that we in fact do a lot of unethical acts. Bandura, on the other hand, he's claiming that we're not deluded or handcuffed in this way, and we can flex our moral muscles often. So how can we directly counteract moral disengagement? One way suggested is through the power of humanization. Most people refuse to behave cruelly toward humanized others under command or without the use of indirect reframes or convoluted psychological processes. People are interested in reducing unprovoked violence and aggression generally. Another way to counteract moral disengagement is to actively work on developing compassion. Compassion can be thought of like a skill comprised of our desires and efforts to alleviate other people's suffering. The development of this skill can be supported, just like other vicariously experienced and mastered skills. Okay, summing up, Bandura's moral disengagement theory proposes people separate their own bad behavior from their moral values to avoid censure. The mechanisms for moral disengagement include various forms of euphemistic language, indirect speech, words with multiple meanings, metaphor, shifts in grammar, like the agent-patient switch. Mechanisms for moral disengagement also include advantageous comparison, displacement of responsibility and diffusion of responsibility, dehumanization, and finally, we covered attribution of blame to victims. Okay, for the discussion post prompt, I'd like you to connect this moral disengagement theory to another theory that we covered in the week on moral values, moral foundations theory. Here's the prompt. Mechanisms of moral disengagement let people avoid self-sanctions for their unethical actions and continue to think of themselves as moral even when they act immorally. How should we understand this theory, which is meant to explain immorality broadly, in relation to the theory that there's important diversity in moral values, what people think is right or wrong? Do you think moral disengagement is used to a different degree or the same extent for people differing in the moral foundations of care, fairness, loyalty, authority, and purity? Please explain your views by describing at least two specific mechanisms of moral disengagement and how you hypothesize they function across people differing in moral values.